Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing some concepts from Chapter 12 of Maxfield and Babbie. Chapter 12 is all about agency records, content analysis, and secondary data. So, a key difference between these and some of the other data collection strategies that we've been discussing are the fact that these methods do not require any contact whatsoever between the researcher and the research subjects. So, unlike surveys or interviews where you may be having a face-to-face conversation with somebody, or certainly field research where you're out there in the field actually doing observations, you can literally just pull up these data sources on your computer in your office and run the analysis, and you don't have to really um, do much else. So, again, no contact between the researcher and the subjects. There are three primary methods of collecting data that sort of fall under this umbrella. So, there's data collected by criminal justice agencies. There is content analysis of social artifacts, and then there's secondary analysis in which data collected for another purpose are then reanalyzed for another purpose. So I'm going to hit on each of these briefly. We'll talk a little bit about agency records first. So there are three types of agency records: published statistics, non-public records collected for internal use, and new data collected by agency staff for specific research purposes. So published statistics, you've probably seen examples of this, and we've talked about this before. There are statistics available from the Census Bureau, from the FBI, the Uniform Crime Reports, the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And you can literally just go and download these data sets and start manipulating them for analysis. This data is good in the sense it's very easy to access, but there are a number of problems with it. First off, much of this data is in an aggregated summary form, and therefore you have to be careful with the unit of analysis, right? Whenever we deal with aggregated summary statistics, we're probably dealing with a group or organization level unit of analysis. We can't go back down and study individual incidents. So you really have to watch the unit of analysis here. Um, Published data, therefore, is very good for looking at highly aggregated patterns and trends. So, for instance, if you're looking at maybe violent crime over time or drug use over time, um, it would be good to use published data for those purposes, because there you're not really caring so much about what's happening at the individual level, but you're more focused on just aggregated trends over time. So, like violent crime over the last 20 years, okay, there having aggregated data is fine. Wouldn't matter. You don't really care about the individual unit of analysis. Non-public agency records. So even though a lot of the aggregated data is available from, like, say, the FBI or the Bureau of Justice Statistics, it may be possible to actually go back to the agencies that collected the data originally and ask them if you can access the individual level reports. Okay, so in other words, if we know that, say, Orlando Police Department submitted aggregate level data that made it into the FBI's UCR, we might be able to go to Orlando Police Department and just ask them nicely if they would give us the individual reports. Okay, so we might be able to do that. So this can be good for getting at the individual unit of analysis or getting more in-depth information. The biggest problem here with just using agency data is that you want to understand how agency records are produced and how they're collected, and you have to be concerned with validity and reliability here. A general rule of thumb is to expect the expected. And so, an example of this, let's say that you're looking at aggregated or let's say annual reported burglaries in a jurisdiction. Burglary and certain types of property crime are fairly consistent from year to year, month to month. Okay, there's always going to be just sort of an expected level of burglaries in the community. But if all of a sudden you see that maybe in 1 month there's no reported burglaries, right? Or maybe in a year that all of a sudden the burglaries really drop, you might want to ask about how they started coding burglaries, because it's possible that the agency that collected the data, maybe they started coding it based on another statute, right? Or maybe they started coding it differently. And so if you see a decline in burglary, it's not necessarily because burglaries in the community at large decreased. It might just be that the agency changed how they collected data. So, before you go talking about some amazing declines in burglary in this community and wondering why, you might want to look at how they actually collected the data in the first place. Another option here is you can actually put the agency to work for you and have them collect data for you in addition to their routine data collection procedures. This is called hybrid data collection. Okay. So it might be possible here to have a criminal justice agency temporarily modify how they collect data for the purposes of some project. There's a real neat example in the book about a study that was done where they were interested in looking at crime committed against tourists. So the researchers that worked with this particular police department, I forget where it was, I think it was in Miami, they had the officers there fill out an additional form if they were taking a report from somebody who was victimized and they were a tourist to that area. And so this way, the researchers were able to get additional information against crimes committed against tourists. The major advantage to this, obviously, is that if you put the agency to work for you in collecting data, you have some control over the measurement and you have some control over the questions that you ask. And also, it's a lot less difficult and costly than actually collecting the data yourself. The main problem is just getting the agency to actually agree to do this, because you're asking them to basically modify their data collection procedures to help you. So, if you have a questionnaire that, say, has the officer complete this 20 question questionnaire every time they go out into the field, they're probably not going to want to do it, right? And so if you can make the data collection addendum a little bit easier for them to do, maybe they'll be more likely to do it. Also, if you can find some benefit to the agency, so not entirely related to your research project, but maybe just say, well, if you do this, we might be able to produce a report for you about crimes against tourists, right? And maybe that's something that the agency is interested in, and that they then would see the benefit of incorporating those questions into their own data collection approaches. So the second overarching type of data collection strategies that we can talk about is content analysis. Content analysis, this is simply the systematic study of messages and the meanings that those messages convey. There's a lot of research out there that incorporates content analysis, and we see content analysis a lot of times of books, magazines, films, songs, speeches, television programs, etc. I know that Dr. Surratt at UCF, for instance, has done some real interesting content analysis looking at rap lyrics and rap music videos and looking at messages in rap lyrics about the police. So that's a real interesting example of content analysis. I peer reviewed a research article a couple of years ago that looked at police department Facebook pages. So the researchers actually went out and they had a sample of police departments that had Facebook pages, and then looked at their Facebook pages and the types of things that these agencies were posting on Facebook, and whether or not they were being racially sensitive, and whether or not they were including pictures of minorities um, as well as other races. So, kind of interesting example of content analysis. Key to content analysis is coding. Okay, so coding is how you actually measure what it is in the content. Okay, so for example, if we were doing content analysis of newspaper editorials, we might have a bunch of editorials and then code them in terms of whether they're liberal or conservative. Okay, the problem with coding is that the terms we use for coding are often highly subjective and open to interpretation. So therefore, before you start on any content analysis enterprise, you're going to want to be very clear about what it is that you're looking for, how you're measuring, and how you're coding. And this is really important, especially if you have multiple people doing the coding. All right, so you want to make sure everybody's on the same page about exactly what we're looking for in our content analysis and what we're looking for in our coding. The major types of coding, there's two basic types. There's manifest coding and latent coding. Manifest coding, that's the visible content, the surface content. In the Facebook example that I just mentioned, where they were looking at Facebook pages of police departments, one of the criteria that they were looking at was just basically the number of people that were pictured in photographs on the Facebook page, and then the gender of those people. So, the number of males, number of females. Okay, so this would be an example of manifest coding because it's very easy to look at pictures on Facebook and code by saying, well, there's 5 people in this picture, and it looks like we have 3 males and 2 females. Even that can get a little subjective, but I mean, for the most part, that's easy to figure out. And also, they coded race. So we can see that we have some white folks here, we have some African American folks, we have some folks that might be Latino. But again, that can be difficult too. So manifest coding is just looking at the visible surface content. And then latent coding is a little bit trickier. Here, we're trying to determine the underlying meaning of the content in the photo. So this would be like if we're looking at photos and maybe trying to determine, like, okay, what's the message that they're trying to convey with this photo? Do people in the photo look like they're happy? Do they look like they're sad? Right? So again, latent coding can be a little bit more subjective and a little bit more interpretation is required here. So again, whenever you do content analysis, you want to be really clear on what exactly it is you're looking for and maybe what constitutes a sad face versus a happy face, right? So you want to be clear about some of the terminology. And again, this is especially important if you have more than one coder involved. And so the book suggests that if you have multiple coders, that you might want to have both coders code some of the same content, and then go back and look later and discuss it and say, okay, why did you code it this way? So that's one way that you can kind of incorporate iterator reliability. So the final method of data collection, sort of under this umbrella of non-contact methods, is secondary analysis. And this is where you have data that was collected by another researcher for another purpose, and you take that data and then you use it to address new research questions. This is actually very common, and it's easy to see why. One, it's very inexpensive and cheap. Okay, it certainly beats the cost of going out and collecting primary data. Another major advantage is that the data is already available now. So, collecting primary data, not only can it be costly, can be very time consuming. If you're doing surveys, it takes a while to go out and collect that data, right? But with secondary data analysis, the data collection's already been done for you, so you can just download that data and, start playing with it. So yeah, it's a lot cheaper than collecting original data. It's a lot faster than collecting original data. Also, you can benefit from the work that other researchers have done. If you use measures that have been used by other researchers, a lot of times those measures have been validated, right? So, they may have very good construct validity. They may be very reliable. They've been tested. So you don't really have to go out and reinvent the wheel. As far as a practical example, here I can speak to one that I've been involved in. So my thesis that I wrote for my master's degree, I used secondary data analysis of survey data that my thesis chair had collected as part of another project. And so this was really great for me as a grad student because I was able to utilize this data. It had already been collected, and I was able to incorporate it into my thesis. So it didn't cost me any money, and it was already there. So I was just able to download it. Actually, I think she gave it to me on a thumb drive, and then it's like, okay, I can start running my analyses. So, that was very good. Some of the problems, though, that we see with secondary data are that it's already been collected. And a lot of times with secondary data, uh, the data was originally collected for another purpose. Okay, and so it can be very difficult then kind of trying to um, reformulate and reuse that data, for your particular research. So, for example, in my research, I was really interested in problem-oriented policing. All right, that wasn't a key concern of my thesis chair when she originally collected the data. She collected the data a few years before for a project she was working on. She didn't even know me then, and she only had one question about problem-oriented policing on that entire survey. Obviously, that question was of great importance to me, and I incorporated that in my thesis, but had I been able to do things my way, I probably would have had 10 questions about problem-oriented policing. But that's one of the problems of secondary data analysis. If you're working with data somebody else has collected for another purpose, it may not necessarily work, for your purpose. And so you may have some measures that aren't exactly the best measures or the measures that you would want to use. But, the trade-off is, hey, secondary analysis, the data is already here, costs nothing to collect, and boom, you already have it. So anyway, it can be good for some purposes. So that pretty much wraps it up for chapter 12. Uh, Really, again, just we talked about and just keep in mind, the different methods of data collection. So agency records. All right, we talked about the different types of agency records in terms of published statistics, non-published agency records, and also new data collection. We talked about content analysis, and then we talked about secondary data. All right. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to shoot me an email, and I would be happy to address them.